I am Joachim Morkand. This story is based on a real patrol call in a Midwestern city of approximately 150,000 people. Names, locations, and identifying details have been changed to protect privacy. I am a patrol police officer, and this is Lie to Me Patrol. People assume the injured person is telling the truth. However, sometimes the most detailed story is the most carefully edited one. And the lie is not in what they say, it's in the parts that they skip. The call came in as an assault. By the time I arrived at the apartment complex where the incident had occurred, maintenance staff were already involved. They told us that they had seen a man bleeding heavily who had entered an apartment they believed to be unoccupied. When we made entry, we found Lex standing near the center of the apartment with his hands on top of his head. He was covered in blood. His lips and eyes were swollen. Blood was on his arms, his clothing, and the floor around him. There was no question that Lex had been involved in a violent physical altercation. I conducted a weapons check and escorted him downstairs to wait for medics. At that point, I attempted to identify him. My first indicator of a lie was an inconsistent identity story. When asked for basic identifying information, Lex provided multiple different birth dates and multiple different social security numbers. Only his phone number appeared to be consistent. At the time, it was unclear whether he was disoriented from the injury, under the influence of alcohol, or being intentionally deceptive. But inconsistent identifying information is always noted because truthful people generally anchor to identity even under stress. Lex eventually stated that he had been in a fight with a man named Jade, which he said explained his injuries. Medics arrived and transported Lex to the hospital. I followed the ambulance there in my patrol cruiser. While at the hospital, Lex had been admitted to a room, and some of the blood had been cleaned from his face. He began talking. He began talking a lot, in fact. He provided extensive detail about the hours leading up to the incident, about drinking alcohol, about emotional and intense conversations that they had had, about tension between himself and Jade. According to Lex, he and his girlfriend Lexi had gone to Jade's apartment to drink and socialize. He described the night as long, emotional, and increasingly uncomfortable. The level of detail was notable, not because it was excessive, but because of where it stopped. This was the second indicator of a lie. There was an asymmetry in the detail that Lex provided. Lex had no difficulty describing conversations they had had, emotions, and how each of them felt by his perspective. Who sat where? Who said what earlier in the night? But when his story reached the moment where a crime would have occurred, precisely why I was there to identify him, that level of detail suddenly vanished. He would say things like, "So that's what happened," and then it just happened. Next thing I knew, I was on the ground. And then without a pause, he would move on to describing what happened after the assault, every single time. The same recurring theme every time. Detail before, vagueness during the event, and then detail after. The pattern repeated consistently throughout the interview. In attempting to clarify, each time I asked Lex to go back and start again, to walk me through the escalation step by step, his response followed the same structure. My third indicator of a lie was the narrative reset phrases that he would use each time when he began to do this. Before restarting, Lex would use preparatory statements such as, "Okay, so this is what has happened," or "This is what happened." "All right, so," or "Let me think." These phrases function as verbal buffers. They are not recollection, they are story preparation. Truthful accounts tend to resume naturally. Fabricated accounts often require a reset. They require these same types of preparatory statements, and when you hear them, it does not necessarily mean that the person is lying, but it is an indicator, and it is something to note from a police perspective. The alleged provocation between them was when Lex alleged that Jade had been touching Lizzie, which this part of the story I did believe. He alleged that Jade had been touching Lizzie on the leg and shoulder throughout the night. When I asked whether he believed these were sexual advances, Lex denied that interpretation. That part I did not believe. Instead, he framed the behavior as intentional antagonism, Jade attempting to provoke him. Lex also stated that Jade had been slapping him on the leg and chest over the course of several hours. Again, very detailed. But when asked how this behavior transitioned into physical violence, this is where the story each time collapsed again. This brings me to the fourth indicator of a lie: avoidance of agency. Lex could not explain who initiated physical contact, what specific action caused the fight to start, what he did with his hands during the time that he was describing. He repeatedly jumped forward in time, bypassing the moment of initiation. In violent encounters, the first physical action is typically burned into memory, especially for true victims. Avoiding that moment is a significant indicator. There was also the aspect of story shift. After repeated attempts to clarify the timeline, Lex altered the narrative. He now claimed that Jade had redirected his aggression towards Lizzie. Lex stated that Jade did not strike her, but that Lex physically intervened by stepping between them. According to Lex, Jade grabbed him by the neck, took him to the ground, and punched him repeatedly in the face. No weapons were used. But even now, Lex could not articulate the exact trigger, the first strike, his own physical response. My suspicion was that Lex was able to decipher what I was attempting to ascertain from the conversation, and he decided to provide me with details that he made up on the moment. I had no proof of that, but that was my suspicion at the moment based on the previous line of lies and deflections that he had provided. There was still several more indicators throughout this story. One was progressive story refinement. Each retelling added enough information to address the previous gap, but never enough to fully explain the event. This is a common pattern in fabricated stories, not outright contradiction, but incremental revision. That's how it progressed within this narrative. Sometimes this incrementally adds new details that were previously lost. Those can be more easily identified than in this case, but incremental revision was the circumstance that was present in this case. So there was also some unusual concerns at the hospital that Lex presented. Despite his injuries, his bloodied face, swelling, visible trauma, Lex repeatedly expressed concern about one thing: that Lizzie's parents might see him, that Lizzie might come in and see him. He was very concerned with anyone seeing him in this current condition. Not about charges, not about his injuries, but about being seen in that condition. Also, not necessarily indicators of a lie, but very unusual behavior. Not something that I typically find from people that have been assaulted in the way that Lex was attempting to describe himself as having been assaulted. So this is, as I said, not a lie specifically, but it is a lie indicator. It's misplaced priority. This concern does not prove deception, but it does suggest shame. It suggests victimhood. It suggests shame, not victimhood. True victims are typically focused on safety, justice, or pain, not appearance or perception. So after speaking with other officers who had remained on scene and interviewed Lizzie and conducted a search of the apartment and the area around where the incident had occurred and spoken with any additional witnesses, interestingly, an entirely different narrative had emerged. The fight appeared to be either mutually agreed upon or initiated by Lex himself. I had already suspected this because I suspected that there was a certain degree of jealousy between Lex and Jade over Jade's constant and suggestive advances towards Lizzie. That aligned with what I had observed: control of the narrative from Lex, strategic vagueness, which he was evident throughout our interaction, avoidance of agency. Being injured does not make someone a victim, it only proves involvement. In the end, I do not believe this incident constituted an assault, not because Lex wasn't injured, but because the person who cannot describe the moment of violence begins and who repeatedly edits that moment out of the story is often concealing their role in it. Closing lesson and takeaways that I took from this and that I hope I can express in this narrative is that liars don't avoid talking. They avoid specific moments. If someone can describe everything except the one detail that determines guilt or innocence, that is not confusion. You are not confused yourself when you hear that coming from other people. That is an intentional omission. And once you learn to listen for what's missing from the narrative, the lie becomes more obvious without ever needing to accuse anyone of it.